Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm glad the hurricane hasn't hit. I'm Barbara Slavin. I direct the Future of Iran program here at the Atlantic Council. I have to say that the issue of human rights is one that we have always focused on here. We do the nuclear issue, we do Iran's economy, we do Iran's regional influence, many other issues, but human rights has been a constant. And outside there's actually a copy of a report that we did in 2016 on how to promote human rights in Iran in a constructive way. So we felt we wanted to return to this topic now. I wanted to make just a couple of introductory remarks before we get to our absolutely fantastic panel. And I think they're important points to make. First, supporting the Iran nuclear deal does not mean condoning Iran's human rights abuses. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action unfortunately did not lead to a dramatic improvement in Iran's human rights posture. In fact, one could say that in recent months things have gotten a lot worse. But what the Jcpoa did do is that it opened the space for a lot of supporters of the nuclear deal to focus even more on human rights, as many of us did starting in 2016. Now that the Jcpoa is in jeopardy, I think it's still possible to walk and chew gum at the same time, to seek a U.S. return to the nuclear deal and still criticize the Iranian government for repressing its own people, jailing dual nationals, etc. Second point, in criticizing Iran, it's also important to recognize that Iran is not an outlier in the Middle East. Many other countries have human rights policies that are as bad or worse. Saudi Arabia has jailed a variety of rights advocates, including the very women who advocated driving in Saudi Arabia, a right that the Saudis have finally granted. And Egypt and Turkey compete for the unhappy position of biggest jailer of civil society and journalists in the region. Israel occupies the West Bank, it strangles Gaza, and of course the United States these days, with our policies on the border in terms of Mexicans and other Central Americans trying to come into the U.S., is not in an optimal position to criticize others. Point three, all of that said, there is much Iran could do to improve its human rights posture for the good of its own people, not to placate critics from the outside. So we're going to discuss this in a constructive spirit, not to demonize, but to illuminate and hopefully come up with some ideas about how we can help improve the situation. We have a really magnificent panel, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy their remarks. We're going to start with Hadi, who is my go-to guy on Iran human rights. In 2008, he founded the Center for Human Rights in Iran. It was formerly the International Campaign for Human Rights in Iran. It has become the leading organization documenting human rights violations in Iran and building international coalitions to support human rights. Previously, Hadi worked with Human Rights Watch as the Iran and United Arab Emirates researcher, although he's a physicist by background, but there you go. We have Suzanne Tomasebi, who's a veteran women's rights and civil society activist, has worked for 2 decades to strengthen civil society and promote human rights in Iran, in the Mena region, and Asia, and internationally. While in Iran, she co-founded the Iran Civil Society Training and Research Center and the 1 Million Signatures campaign, which was a grassroots effort to end gender-based laws in Iran. And she continues to maintain strong ties with Iranian civil society. And finally, Dokey Hyun, and it's actually Dokey's idea that we do this panel, and I hope it's the beginning of more collaboration between the Atlantic Council and Freedom House. Dokey heads the Middle East and North Africa division at Freedom House, where she oversees programs on Iran, Jordan, Tunisia, and Egypt. She's also worked on Yemen and Bahrain. Before joining Freedom House, she worked at the Democracy Coalition Project, where she led multilateral strategies at the United Nations and advocated with governments on human rights priorities, and she's lived and worked in both Iran and Egypt, so she brings a really good regional perspective. So I ask you to silence your cell phones, and if I could invite our panelists to come and sit up here, we will begin. Hadi.
Yes.
I said you were my go-to guy, so I'm going to start with you. If you could please just give us an overview of the human rights situation in Iran, particularly what has improved in the last couple of years since the Jcpoa, what has gotten worse.
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara, and good morning to you all. Thanks to Atlantic Council, Barbara and Dokey and Suzanne for putting this panel together. It's an honor to be with you. To talk about where Iran's human rights stands right now, it is a little depressing for me of having participated in forums like this for nearly 20 years, that I always have to say the human rights situation in Iran is in crisis. And I want to just look at the last 10 years very briefly to say where we are now, particularly since 2009. That'd be a good benchmark to begin, because that is the time when the country was engulfed in protests by millions and hundreds of thousands of people protesting the re-election of Ahmadinejad in what a good number of people believed was a bogus result, and led to the Green Movement for about 6 to 9 months. We know that those protests and their demands were very strongly repressed, and that was the onset compared to the previous 10 years, I would say, especially since 97, when there had been some movement in the country toward reform, that everything really turned around 180 degrees, and we began a very repressive state where intelligence security agency collaborating very closely with judiciary became completely unhinged and allowed to repress civil society, protesters, independent voices, academics. It was such a harsh repression that 4 years later, when Rouhani was running for president, his platform, we should remember domestically, although he talked a lot about nuclear negotiations and the economy and lifting sanctions, but domestically he propelled himself to the front of the pack by acknowledging what he called the security state, a draconian security state that had covered the country for 4 years, and he promised his presidency would be to roll back that security state, that we have passed that, the Islamic Republic is secure enough that it doesn't need that level of securitization. And he gave a lot of hope, raised a lot of hopes that his presidency in 2013 would be beginning of rollback of that. And that's why I want to look at these two particular epochs, because his first 4 years, he really achieved nothing. But he maintained support, relative popular support, by insisting that the nuclear deal and the negotiations and lifting of the sanctions are so complex, so time-consuming, which they were indeed. They took 2-3 years to negotiate, that he couldn't prioritize domestic civil rights and civil liberties and lifting of that security state. And yet he sat pretty quietly during those 4 years as the judiciary, security, intelligence forces reinforced their repression and in a way made it clear that Rouhani is not in position to dictate to them any change of policies. So that security state and repression continued. He did one symbolic act of passing something called the Citizens' Rights Charter, which really has remained as a document, hasn't been implemented. But as 2016 campaign rolled around and he was running for re-election, again he came back much stronger than before, focusing on human rights and civil liberties, and raised the hopes that in his second term he will finally, having achieved the nuclear deal and the sanctions being lifted, he will put his eggs on that basket finally and just before his inauguration, there were many calls on him to implement concrete policies. That's around August of 2016. We're well 2 years into that, and not only nothing has happened, he has moved actually completely to the side of judiciary, intelligence, security forces by complementing them through his own intelligence ministry, which has become again very proactive. And before that, it was the Revolutionary Guards Intelligence Organization that was the main organization detaining, imprisoning people of all kinds, political activists, students, journalists, dual nationals, religious minorities, you name it. But the intelligence ministry today is responsible for two prominent cases I want to bring to your attention. So we always have hundreds of political prisoners in Iran, and especially civil society activists, human rights defenders, and most importantly right now, what has become the trend is prosecuting lawyers who choose to represent prisoners of conscience or political prisoners. Those lawyers themselves are being detained and prosecuted and sentenced to long sentences. Which means effectively due process has evaporated. The judiciary now has a list, an unknown list of kosher lawyers that a prisoner can choose. However, no one knows who's on there, and anyway, those lawyers cannot be trusted not to be cooperating with the judge and the interrogators. So, for example, the most prominent human rights defender and lawyer in the country, Nasrin Sotoudeh, she's quite well known internationally. She was detained about a month and a half ago, and it is really Kafkaesque because when they detained her, they told her, you're serving a 5-year sentence. And she said, what 5-year sentence? And they said, oh, we had in absentia, in private, prosecuted you on such and such charges, which are always bogus, no evidence, because they all are under the very ambiguous charge of acting against national security and so on. So she's serving a 5-year sentence, supposedly that she wasn't even in court and couldn't defend herself and didn't know what the evidence was. And as she protested, given how strong and experienced she is, she launched into a hunger strike. They have detained a close associate of her, Sami, keeping him hostage. As she continued her hunger strike, and he went on hunger strike just 2-3 weeks ago, her husband was the main conduit of bringing that information to the general public. Now, about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, they detained him. And I'm pointing this out because that just shows how unhinged and without control the security intelligence forces are, and the judiciary, and Rouhani is very silent. Of course, we have Narges Mohammadi, another prominent human rights defender, serving 10-year sentence. Abdul Fattah Soltani serving 13-year sentence. So to give you an overview, things have not got better since Jcpoa. Actually, since the election of Trump, Rouhani has chosen to side with human rights violators and perpetrators of these violations by keeping quiet or allowing his own intelligence ministry to take the lead. And the only positive thing I can point out to, which is really a result of a decade of activism by anti-death penalty Iranian groups and activists in the country and abroad, like ourselves and other groups and advocates supporting them, and I must say EU for making that a cornerstone of their human rights advocacy with Iran, is death penalty. Iran was the leading executioner after China, where the numbers are unknown.
Per capita
Per capita, Iran definitely was number one, had reached about 1,000 executions. Majority of them, 80-85%, were drug-related for small drug offenses of really poor, illiterate, vulnerable people. And there was so much UN, EU, international, domestic pressure on them that finally they relented because they looked at these people they're executing. Drug epidemic has not been addressed or been reduced at all, and they were killing the poor and vulnerable that was no threat to them, who were, because of their economic disadvantage, were involved in small-time drug dealing. So they finally changed the law about 18 months ago, where the possession amount resulting in death penalty was increased. And as a result, we have seen a precipitous drop in the numbers from 1,000, first 600, and then last year 400, so 450. That is a serious reduction. And we believe that is an example where you get countries from Japan to Brazil, to EU, everyone protesting it consistently and constantly, and it worked. However, application of death penalty doesn't mean hasn't become more politicized than what I call revenge killings by the judiciary against threats they foresee. We just had 4 examples of it in the last 2 months. There are a group of religious minority who are actually Shias. They're not minorities. They're just called dervishes. They're Sufis. They practice in their own way and had always been tolerated till about 10 years ago when Ahmadinejad came to power. They went after them because they were becoming very organized, their houses of prayer, their meetings. They got very frightened by that. They've been repressing them. There was a major protest by them about 3 months ago. There was actually a bus driven into security forces where about 2 or 3 policemen were killed by this bus. And then as they put hundreds of people on trial and have given them again in the range of 8 to 12-year sentences, one bus driver whose lawyer says that he wasn't even on location, he wasn't the bus driver, was very quickly prosecuted and executed. That's an example of revenge killing to me. Just last week, 3 Kurdish young men who have been in prison for almost a decade, 2 brothers and another one, accused of assassination of a Friday prayer imam, but no evidence against them. Even, evidence surfacing that people in the family of the person assassinated who were at the scene are saying these people were not on the scene. However, they were accused. There was a lot of international pressure not to execute them, so we believed we have saved their lives for about the last 5-6 years. Last week, concurrent with an attack on an Iranian Kurdish political party in Iraqi Kurdistan, where missiles were launched by Revolutionary Guards on their meeting, they executed these 3 people out of the blue. And that's another example of revenge killing to me. And that's what really worries me as the country's political, economic, social situation goes through turbulence, that if we don't note and protest this kind of executions, we could see more and more of them, of innocent people. Just guilt by association or ethnicity or religion will send them to the gallows. So the situation actually this year is very fluid. I believe we're in uncharted territory for the good reason that the United States has thrown international affairs into complete chaos and has such a strong focus on Iran. And I believe international community, especially countries that deal with Iran, Europeans, those who want to save the nuclear deal, have to focus on the human rights issues and not leave it to just one particular group who has other issues with Iran and right now taking a very hard line within this administration. And they are very vocal on human rights. We can discuss how effective that's been, but the key thing is that we need all actors and stakeholders, especially those who are dealing closely with Iran, to focus on human rights and not believe that's a secondary issue as it was discussed 4 years ago during the Jcpoa negotiations.
Let me just add one follow, and that is the question of dual nationals. That is one thing that the Trump administration has put forward. We have a number of them. Siamak Namazi, we have environmentalists, members of the Persian Wildlife Heritage Foundation, unjustly jailed. Their leader, who was a Canadian Iranian, died under very suspicious circumstances. Is there anything going on in relation to them? We also have British Iranians, Nazanin Radcliffe and so on.
Well, I know the British government has become much more proactive in the case of Nazanin Zarqawi, the British Iranian mother of a 2-year-old who's been
now
in jail.
Now 5-year-old, I think. 4 or 5-year-old.
4-year-old, probably, yeah. They have not gained her release. With regard to the American Iranians, there's been some movement. It's always hard to tell because there are international intermediaries usually brokering some kind of a deal to release these people, especially, for example, the Sultan of Oman has always traditionally been active. We don't know what is going on behind the scenes. There's been a couple of small steps. So, for example, Bagher Namazi, the 80-plus-year-old prominent individual who's with his son Siamak was in jail, finally been sent home, is under house arrest. I think it may be concerns of pressure or demands by the US administration, but more likely it's the fact that they did not want to end up with a disaster on their hands. 80-plus-year-old person kept pretty much in solitary confinement for more than a year, was a liability, especially with a heart problem. There's another case which is not really political, but this couple, one of them Iranian American and Zoroastrian art dealer Karan Wafadari and his wife, were also detained and sentenced to very lengthy sentence on complete bogus charges. They are out on a very heavy bail. But, for example, the American Chinese graduate student from Princeton, yes, remains in very, very dire situation and no movement on his case. Or Siamak himself, the only opening has been that now he's in a public ward rather than a solitary confinement. But they are really hostages, and it is very disturbing to see the mentality of leaders of Islamic Republic 40 years on still looking at hostage taking as a mean and a tool for foreign policy objectives.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hadi. I want to turn now to Suzanne. There's been a lot of attention on the women's movement over the years in Iran. Lately, we've had the White Wednesdays, the anti-hijab movement, but this is a long tradition with many issues. So if you could just briefly tell us where the women's issue stands right now in Iran, what people are doing.
Sure. I think it's important to, before I talk about all the sort of challenges that women face, is also talk about the achievements that they've had, so that we're looking at this issue within context. So while women face incredible legal discrimination in Iran, their social gains have been considerable. So literacy rates are very high, especially for the generation born after the revolution. It's 90-some%, close to 100%, so it's very high. Birth rate is very low in Iran. Age of marriage is very, very low. It's 13, but actual age of marriage is 25 to 27 years old. So these are all development indicators. And over 50% of the university students are women, so women are more educated than their male counterparts. It's important to look at this. While workforce participation of women is low, women have all sorts of jobs. So they're doctors, they're lawyers, they're MPs, they're taxi drivers, they're bus drivers. So they've broken many, many barriers. And I think it's important to look at that, the achievements that women have had, before we look at all the discriminations, because we don't want to define them as victims only, because they're definitely not. Traditionally, the women's movement has looked at addressing legal discrimination, so discrimination within the law, having to do with the family, the criminal code, as some of the major barriers to women's equality, but also has looked at violence against women, whether it's domestic violence, so private violence, but public forms of violence that limit women's unfettered access to the public space, such as regulations that impose, that require mandatory hijab, or limitations to participate in sports stadiums or singing, etc. So they've looked at these issues. In recent years, they've started looking at women's participation, representation in government, in sort of as ministers and high levels of governments. Since I was in Iran for the last, I would say, like almost 20 years now, they've been demanding that women are allowed to run as president. So these are, so it shows the wide range of issues that women are dealing with, some very basic issues like equal rights in marriage, to demands for running for presidency. But in recent years, the focus of the women's movement has also expanded to include other issues, such as what in Iran they call social vulnerability. So a lot of this is, some of it is maybe development issues that the state was dealing with, or now maybe has reached a form of crisis, and social scientists have different opinions on why that crisis is. Many actually, and I agree with this, is that one of the reasons that women are dealing with these social vulnerabilities is because in planning perhaps there wasn't enough of a gender perspective. So for example, the way in which HIV/AIDS is being transmitted has changed in Iran. It used to be through drug use. Now it's through sexual contact, and women are being infected with HIV/AIDS more often. We have migration, internal migration in Iran, so you have informal settings around big cities, and these create particular challenges for women. So these are some of the issues that Iranian women's movement is dealing with. Also issues such as women's homelessness, women's drug use, but also more sophisticated issues such as the rights of minority women, sort of looking at the intersections of rights issues. And these are all the various issues that the civil society inside of Iran is working with. And when we talk about women's issues in the West, we tend to look at it from a very sort of confrontational rights abuse kind of a way, and it adds to the securitization of women's issues. And this is something the women's movement has worked very hard throughout the years. Even when we were advocating for legal reform, we tried very hard to de-securitize the conversation and the approach so that we can deal with the problems at a societal level with a social lens. And this has been a huge challenge. So recent comments, I think, by the U.S. administration on women's issues really pushes it back into, so the focus is from a very securitized lens. I want to sort of piggyback on what Hadi said in terms of the 2009 elections, because something happened to the Iranian civil society in general, and I'm going to talk more specifically about the women's movement, but I think this is somewhat of what happened to civil society generally after 2009. The repression was so strong that a lot of people were arrested. There were served prison sentences. Many of the activists end up leaving Iran. Then immediately after this, in 2010, we had the sanctions, and that took, it impacted economically the Iranian population, especially the middle class, very severely, including civil society. So many of the civil society activists who remained in Iran, who perhaps were feeling repressed, their space had shrunk, but wanted to continue activism, were forced out of that space because their work was primarily volunteer, and they had to work 2-3 jobs in order to do it. Now, and this kind of continued, I piggybacked on 4 years of repression and specifically targeting women's movement anyway. But so with the election of Hassan Rouhani, we expected that civil society space would open up, and it did for some sectors. Mm-hmm. I think mostly it wasn't necessarily a national policy to allow for civil society activism. It was a personal policy. People who had commitments to civil society, who understood civil society, whether in their ministries or at the local government level, they allowed for civil society participation. So if you go to Shiraz, for example, they talk about how it's that the local government is actually very supportive, but other places they're not as supportive. But so we expected the space to open up. It didn't necessarily open up for women. The one thing that happened is that intense level of control that was hallmark of the Ahmadinejad period ended. So during Ahmadinejad's period, the first 4 years and certainly the second 4 years, even if 4 or 5 people got together, their meetings would be disruptive. And people couldn't travel, they would be interrogated if they were travel, but that level of scrutiny ended, and women's groups started rebuilding their movement. And now they're working in a whole range of issues. And I'll go through that maybe if I have time to go through the issues that they're the sort of the kinds of work that they're doing, which is pretty innovative.
Well, let me just interrupt you there, because there's been a lot of focus on the anti-hijab protests. The women getting up on the utility boxes and taking off their headscarves and putting them on poles and whatnot. So list a couple of the other issues, if you would, that women are focused on.
Okay, yeah. So so all those issues that I talked about that are important issues to the women's movement, there's actually somebody on the ground working on it. So I'm picking this from the kinds of work that they're doing. So there's a group called Lili Arshad's group, which is the Khane Khorshid, the House of Sun, that's working with drug addicted and homeless women, but also some sex workers. There's Omida Mehr that works with children, with girls in out-of-home care. There's a group that's working on violence against women, and they actually had meetings across the country with over 1,000 women to sort of talk to them about the issues that they're facing in terms of violence. And they worked with a lawyers group who came up with a sample law to address violence against women. And so they're talking to the parliament and to the government as much as they can to sort of make sure that the law that's now before parliament actually includes some of these provisions that they've come up with. There's a group that's working on anti-harassment, another group that's working on prevention of sexual harassment in factories with blue-collar workers, another group that's working on economic issues with women. One is working on the economic issues that single women who've never been married are working on. So it's really a range of issues, and they're from development to rights to peace. So issues such as how are the environmental changes impacting local communities from a gendered perspective. So it's pretty sophisticated in that sense, even though they don't have a lot of space and they face a lot of pressures. Women's groups, women human rights defenders are taking it upon themselves, and they're facing those pressures in order to address these issues in a systematic way. Yeah. But I just want to make one quick point.
Sure.
So this has happened. It took several years before the women's movement started becoming active, with very little national level policy support. But they're doing it despite risks to themselves. But what happened after 2009 internationally, and it made sense at that time, mostly because so many people had left Iran, so many activists had left Iran. There was this sort of focus on a civil society in exile. The international community started working with people who had left Iran, who were in exile. But now, civil society is active in Iran, and in particular the women's movement, where I have, where I'm most in contact. And I think that the perspective of the international community sort of needs to change a little bit to create some sort of balance between the civil society in exile, and some of them are doing very good work, but the civil society that's actually in Iran. We're talking about the future of Iran. There's a lot of proclamations made on behalf of the Iranian people, but the voice of that civil society is largely absent because it's repressed at home, and we're not really seeking it. I think we're not seeking it, or we're not tapped into it enough, and we have to come up with creative strategies to hear how they see the future of Iran.
That's a perfect segue to Dokey. I mean, Dokey, you've worked in this area for so many years, and I tried to touch on this in the report that's sitting outside. What are the techniques that work? What are the techniques that don't? I think one point that Hadi made, which is very important, is that in the campaign against the excessive use of the death penalty, multilateral support was really important. And of course we haven't mentioned, but the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran, the UN Human Rights Council. Now the United States has left this body. So, is that going to diminish the American voice in this? And, what over the years have you seen that actually does make a positive difference?
I would have to first start by saying that I don't think in all the years that I've really worked on human rights and democracy promotion that I've actually seen a coherent democracy and human rights agenda towards Iran by the United States government. We've never had one, frankly. And so I think we have to start from the position of deciding that we want one, that we want a democracy and human rights agenda on Iran, and that would then entail a set of sort of benchmarks, it would entail a set of goalposts, it would entail asks, and that we would then advance those asks in negotiations with Iran. We would use multilateral fora to emphasize them, to amplify them. We would build global consensus around them. What we've had up until now are expressed concerns about human rights violations in Iran. And no matter what administration you look at, that's really what we've had. What's always outshadowed that is strategic security-related issues related to Iran. And that's where we are today. What I see today is not something new. It's really not something new. I think we've been here before. It's just that it kind of looks slightly different because we have an administration that is taking a more hawkish approach and is also looking at Iran that has expanded in the region. And now they're trying to figure out how to get the country to retreat from Syria, from Yemen, from Iraq. And so they're building another sanctions sort of policy. Whether they're going to succeed or not, we'll see. I think the Iranian people are definitely feeling the pressure. The Iranian government is definitely feeling the pressure. The question is, what are the Iranian people going to gain at the end of this road? I think when we look at what happened with the Jcpoa and that particular effort was that at the end of that, the U.S. government decided that they were not going to talk about human rights or democracy issues in that particular process. That was a decision that was made, and despite some urging by some groups, but I will say that I think human rights organizations and civil society groups failed at that time to really press forward some demands and get some of these issues on the agenda. The hope was if we could get a security deal on this nuclear issue, space would open up and we could talk about the other issues. Right. And Iranians could benefit from economic sort of gains. That didn't happen. I don't think most Iranians gained economically. And I think that's why you see the sort of new round of protests taking place starting late last year and throughout this year. So the way I look at it, I think, we do have a responsibility to, if we are going to sanction the government and the people, which is very painful, and I'm not advocating for that, but if we are doing that, we have a responsibility to the Iranian people to leave them with something, leave them with a chance to open up their society. So we need some democracy benchmarks. We need some human rights benchmarks. And I would say that we need political will to do that. So I would start there. In terms of sort of what's useful, what sort of approaches are useful, what's not useful. So let me start with what's not useful. What's not useful is a lack of transparency and clarity on what we want sort of with the Iranian sort of human rights landscape. We condemn the human rights violations when it's appropriate and when it's convenient, but we don't ask for something specific. So I went back and I looked at this administration's track record on when they spoke out on human rights violations, but they weren't really specific about what we're talking about. So are they calling for the release of Nasrin Sotoudeh? Are they calling for how about Mousavi and Karoubi? I mean, have we said anything about them? What are we going to do in the future when it comes to sort of the elections that are coming up? Are we going to call out the Guardian Council for violating the constitutional rights of the Iranian people? Are we going to call on the Supreme Leader when he violates the Constitution? Sort of very specific interventions, I think, that highlight not just the human rights violations, but the root democratic deficits of the Iranian political system. I think we should be doing, and I think we should be cataloging these things, because these are things that Iranian Democrats and dissidents and human rights defenders all know. They're already talking about these things inside Iran. They're writing about these things in prison. We need to echo that. We need to also be saying that. So I think more clarity in more concrete terms, what democratic deficits they are and how they should be changed so that Iranians could benefit from a more democratic society would be very helpful. What's harmful? Instrumentalizing human rights. Talking about human rights in a way to actually, we talk about it when it's appropriate, but only to sort of shame the government in a punitive way. But
I call it weaponizing human rights.
Instrumentalizing, weaponizing, but not really, again, not have no concrete agenda. And I just have to say, there have been places in the world where we've had concrete agendas on human rights. Burma's a great example. Now, Burma's not in a perfect place today, but Burma was under a military junta. And we had a guided transition process with enormous amount of pressure on Burma to get Burma's military government to transfer power to a civilian government. So it's not impossible, it's completely doable. What else is not helpful? Working unilaterally. We all know working unilaterally is not helpful. It's not good for the United States. It's not really effective, typically. And what we've seen is with Iran, working multilaterally works better. Building global consensus works better. So working with European allies and others, when we built that sanctions regime on the Jcpoa, we even had the South Koreans and the Japanese and everybody on board with that. So, and I have heard this issue, I've had this argument come to me, people say, well, people aren't, governments aren't going to put pressure on human rights, that, and that's just not true. They will, actually. I've talked to plenty of governments around the world about the human rights situation in Iran, and they stand ready to work with the United States and others if there is a real, genuine democracy agenda on Iran. So I think we've got to make a decision if we want that. What else doesn't work? Repeatedly using sanctions that hurt, but for short-term gain. I mean, if we are going to use sanctions and we're going to hurt the population, we owe it to that people to leave them with a chance to open up their society. Threats. I don't think threats work. I think, it really diminishes global consensus. Nobody around the world wants another war in the Middle East or another conflict or destabilized Iran, so I just don't think that's helpful. So what's useful? Decoupling democracy and human rights from our strategic objectives with Iran. I think that if we don't want to have a grand bargain with Iran or work towards trying to deal with both issues at the same level, we decouple them. Mm-hmm. But we shouldn't put human rights and democracy down here and then put our strategic objectives up here, because it gets back to where we are today. It's this sort of short-term vision. We need a short-term fix for Iran, but in the end of the day, the Iranian regime benefits from that. They love the cat and mouse game. They'll retreat for another 4 or 5 years, repress their own society, and then take another opportunity to expand, build negotiating chips. At the end of the day, we're not at a better place. So we need a more long-term vision that incorporates democracy and human rights benchmarks, goalposts, that's at the same level. If you want to approach them sort of separately, that's fine, but they should be at the same level. Working multilaterally, I mentioned that.
Right.
I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah. One other question, and you've worked on the region more broadly, and the last time we had an event on Iran human rights, we had someone from Human Rights Watch who also talked about the region as well as Iran. What about the argument you get, well, why are you picking on Iran? Look at Saudi Arabia, look at Egypt, look at Turkey, look at Israel, look at Bahrain, look at pretty much every other government in the region that has some issues. How do you respond to that kind of complaint?
I think we should be picking on everybody. I mean, I frankly, I think we should be working on Saudi Arabia. We have leverage with Saudi Arabia. We have leverage with Egypt, in particular Egypt.
Yeah.
We have 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt. And so I could go on and on about what kind of approach we should be taking on Egypt and what we're doing on Tunisia. I think, for example, in Tunisia, we're making a mistake by sort of ramping down our public diplomacy and really not engaging on Tunisia. So every country is different. And every country in the Middle East needs attention on human rights and democracy issues. So I don't fall for that. I think we should have a human rights and democracy agenda here in the United States and everywhere, particularly the Middle East.
Excellent, excellent. Let me give our other speakers a chance. Is there anything that Dokey said that you would like to amplify or respond to in some way before we open up to our eager
I'll
audience?
just say something briefly, because again, for decades, this question been put forward both in Europe and here especially, and in the South, global South, that, in Saudi Arabia, they don't even have a constitution.
Right.
Iran has elections, constitutions. Why are you asking this? And I always say it's not us or you who is going to be the flag bearer of human rights protection in Iran, and then you have to feel ashamed you're doing nothing on Saudi Arabia. First of all, do something on Saudi Arabia and other countries. But second of all, Iran, in terms of its social historical evolution, is at a very different stage, and it has a very vibrant population demanding these rights and fighting for it for 100 years. Iranians like to think today they're continuing the struggle of the 1905 constitutional revolution, that the ideals they're fighting for is the same in 1905, in 1953, in 1979, and today. They really see this as a historical evolution, and we are supporting them, you know. That is why, you know, I would ask Brazil, Japan's vote, or, you know, Europeans to focus on that, that we're not asking you to become, you know, the forefront of this movement. There is this movement, very widespread in Iran, struggling, and we're asking you to recognize it as an important element of this country.
Yeah, I think you sort of commented on how we have leverage with other countries. Leverage is important. You have to have relations in order to have leverage, and we haven't had relations with Iran. The U.S. hasn't had relations with Iran for 40 years. And this impacts civil society negatively too. The women's movement, I was talking to a colleague of mine, and I said, you know, really, it's very depressing. It's never been so incredibly isolated. The civil society, it's the most isolated that it's ever been, that I remember, since the reform period, then when, you know, was the flourishing of civil society. And I think it's really important to break that isolation. So that isolation requires that you also have relations with the government, that you're talking to government, you know, like the human rights rapporteur and the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights needs to engage with the government. It can't emulate the work of human rights organizations that have no access to Iran. It's a UN mandate, and it needs to work differently. And just regionally, I also want to make mention, yes, especially after the Arab revolutions, I think a lot of people got scared in the US and in the region that revolutions and change may actually lead to sort of religious governments in the region. And there was this crackdown, and it's, and you know, in the name of fighting extremism or whatever, it's a coalition of these governments, not very democratic at all, not much different than the extremists that they're fighting, many of them, who instead of actually fighting extremism, really crack down on civil society. And it's an unsaid sort of agreement between the West and these countries because they're afraid of it. And until you put human security at the center of your security policy in the Middle East, and until your policy is not specifically and only directed at the security of the US and the security of Israel and other sort of, you know, states, human rights violating states, we're not going to have change on human rights. Human rights is actually very political. It really is a tool for the security interests of the US and its allies in the region. And we need to focus on the human security of people who live there, who have no other alternative but to make that space their own.
Very well put. All right. I'm going to open to the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Say your name and ask an actual question. Oh, hi, please, right here in the front. We have an old colleague of mine.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Tom Frank, Arab Weekly, formerly with USA Today. Barbara, what the Trump administration has said over and over again, that they stand with the Iranian people. What effect do you think that's having on human rights or the overall situation in Iran?
It's a reference to a speech that Secretary of State Pompeo gave in California. He said that, you know, that it was called Supporting Iranian Voices.
Right, in Los Angeles, and also at the Heritage Foundation, and Trump himself has said and tweeted all that.
Yeah. Who wants to grab that? Is it helpful? I mean, or not?
I can. I think it can be helpful if it's backed with some kind of authentic set of ideas that would actually help. And I just don't think there is that sort of set of authentic ideas. If you look at Secretary Pompeo's 12-point list of demands, everyone's looked at it, and there's gotten a lot of criticism around sort of, is this a really good starting point for negotiations? But the first thing that came to my mind is there's absolutely nothing on that 12-point list that even if the Iranian government met it, would help the Iranian people, not one thing. So that just smacks of inauthenticity when you say we stand with the Iranian people. At the end of the day, they'd still be left with the short end of the stick.
And again, the question is, what are they doing concretely to stand with the Iranian people? And if that means protecting, promoting, defending their human rights, again, are they using the available instruments as a beginning point where U.S. is not alone and unilateral, but recognizing, for example, that Human Rights Council has a special rapporteur on Iran for 7-8 years now who hasn't been led into the country. This is the perfect time to make an international coalition and insist this will not be weaponizing human rights. It would not be just serving U.S. policy interests, so it won't be seen as a politically expedient call, but make an international coalition and insist Iran should allow the special rapporteur to visit prisons and go into the country and at least have one internationally neutral official be on the ground. That would be a beginning, for example. But what do we see instead? We see U.S. leaving the Human Rights Council and therefore having no role in that process or no interest in it. That is the kind of minimum thing they could, if they were really serious to pursue something like Dokey said, some sort of concrete plans that and benchmarks. How do you move forward? But we don't see much of
Did
that.
you want to? Yeah.
And I want to add to that. As Hadi said, we've had this mandate, and I think there was like a glimmer of hope and a small space in time where, after the Green Movement crackdown, the Obama administration decided to build a coalition and establish this special rapporteur mandate. That happened in 2011. We're in 2018, and that mandate holder has not gotten enough support. Mandate holders that are supposed to monitor the situation in a country with a human rights situation as chronic as Iran's get international support, which means that at the policy level, it should be much higher at the policy level. Pompeo, for example, should be tweeting about it. Trump should be saying Iran should be letting the UN Special Rapporteur in. It should be it should be on that list, as Hadi said. Why isn't it on that list? In addition, we have a human rights resolution every year that comes up in March at the UN Human Rights Council. That resolution is blank. There's nothing in that resolution that lays out what the Iranian government should do, what human rights violations are being committed, what are the democratic deficits in Iran's political system that, there's nothing in that resolution. That's a blank piece of paper. That's an agenda right there. That's a multilateral agenda that we worked on as the US government. We built a coalition of states, we led it with Sweden, and we've left it blank. So the question is, it exists. Let's use it. And the fact that the United States is no longer on the Human Rights Council, that's terrible, but I would say that they could still work on the sidelines. A lot of non-members do work and advance their priorities, even though they're not members. So. It doesn't preclude them.
Suzanne, you want to add?
I think for many of the people that I'm in touch with, it rings very hollow, this support for the Iranian population, because the Iranian people, because it's supported by sanctions that are supposed to be the worst ever sanctions. It's supported by a policy of economic warfare at a time when Iranians are in the streets because they're suffering economically. It's intended to create economic collapse. A country can't bounce back from that. I don't care if you manage to create regime change. I really doubt that will happen. But even if you do, you can't bounce back from economic collapse, for decades. And so I think people who are sophisticated enough to understand this sort of see this as declaration as very hollow. And I think that there's a growing group of very sophisticated civil society activists who see the contradiction in U.S. policy in the region, and are critical of that.
I would add also the travel ban. That was the first thing that came to mind when Pompeo spoke in Los Angeles. There wasn't a single Iranian who introduced him at the event, even though it was supposed to be an outreach to the diaspora here in the U.S. There were no Iranians sitting in the front row. They were all up in the balcony. And none of them spoke out until a couple of days later in support of Pompeo's comments. So it was just very, very strange. It was much more polemical and political than it was an actual step in support of real human beings, in my view. Yes, Ed, there.
I'm Ed Martin from the Center for Interfaith Engagement at Eastern Mennonite University. And here in the United States, particularly during the civil rights movement and basically human rights pushes, often religious leaders, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, have been very active and out in front. And I wonder, in Iran, can you identify specific religious leaders or organizations that are active in promoting human rights in Iran?
Interesting question.
It is an interesting question, and indeed, back in '97, when the reform movement took off, election of that president very much owed itself to a theological debate, which at the time I thought was a genuine beginning of a Shia reformation, because it included so many clerics and highly educated Ayatollahs reinterpreting Shiaism and modern times. And definitely human rights was part of the discourse. The biggest human rights center academically set up was in Qom, Mufid University.
Mufid, yeah.
And they were quite active during that era. So I don't think that all Shia clerics in Iran, support the state's policies. But they are being repressed too. Yeah. We have a major Ayatollah named Ayatollah Sanei, who has literally been under house arrest and his offices ransacked and silenced, his website taken away, and along with a number of others. There is that debate but they just like others, they don't have the space to really make their voices heard or take a leading role. So in that sense, no, we don't hear many voices, but it's part of the general repression. It doesn't mean they don't exist.
Can I comment on that? Iranian society has changed, and so, along with that, so have, people in the ruling class, because they see that their children are, their daughters, for example, are demanding different things, or their sons are demanding different things. And so you do have many clerics who actually support human rights, and Ayatollah Sanei is one of them. For the women's movement, he was very supportive of the demands of the women's movement, but he's under pressure. But I want to point to something very recent that, for me, was incredibly hopeful, and I have just a different lens on it. But there were reportedly a number of rapes that happened in Iran Shahr, which is a tiny little city in Sistan Baluchistan province, which when the Human Development Report was published in the early 2000s, this Sistan Baluchistan ranks last on every single development indicator, and particularly on women's issues. And it's, culturally, it's a place where women face a lot of discrimination as well as the legal discriminations. But the Friday prayer leader came forward with this announcement that women have been raped. And he, Maulana Abdul Hamid, who is the leader of the Sunnis in that area, who is very well regarded, and is, he also came forward and made a comment. They called on the Iranian government and the judiciary, who completely failed to actually investigate and see this through, which is extremely problematic and depressing. But the other developments were very positive. And Maulana Abdul Hamid actually came forward and warned the families and said that these women are, they are not to blame, and you have to guarantee their safety. So I see that, and I actually credit this to the women's movement, that in even the smallest areas, and even among clerics and religious leaders, the rights of women are being acknowledged. Even at the political level, there's resistance to it. So I think we have a lot of people, whether it's on the rights of religious minorities or rights of women, a lot of religious leaders who are, who have changed, who are vocalizing more progressive positions.
I want to ask you, we had a piece on our blog, Iran Source, recently about movies that are highlighting the issue of domestic violence and the fact that women many women, married women who faced abuse, are leaving their husbands, and in a way that one didn't see before. I was just curious. You mentioned that there's legislation in Parliament about domestic abuse. Could you describe it a little bit more?
They haven't been very public with the legislation, so and I know that they actually consulted with different groups, including some civil society groups, in sort of drafting it initially, but they haven't made it very public. It's gone to the Parliament. A lot of the provisions have been sort of contested by some members within the Parliament, and then now the Guardian Council. So it's back and forth at that stage. But one of the issues was that there's too much criminalization of relations, and so there was so this was one of the main. There's too much criminalization of
so it's not going anywhere
fast.
But
it's not going anywhere fast, and it's definitely not going to be anything I think that women's groups want. But I think it's a step, and we have one really good model that the women's groups have actually put out, and they're engaging. So hopefully, even if we can get some sort of legislation that's somewhat positive, even if it's not comprehensive, I think it would be a good thing. We have also in Iran something that's happened that's more recent, is that we have the emergence of a lot of safe houses for a range of, for homeless women, for drug addicts, but also for people who are suffering from domestic violence. And it was a very slow entry into this. Not all of these shelters are actually working with a gendered perspective, but I remember when people started talking about this, they couldn't even talk about it publicly in the early 2000s.
And there are more women in this parliament than in previous parliaments, my understanding.
Yes.
And there are a sprinkling of women in, the head of Iran Air is a woman. There are some fairly high women in the foreign ministry. You see a few, although Rouhani never came through with his pledge to name women ministers.
He said he would, he didn't come through with that. He said he would do 30% women in positions, in upper management. And recently he talked about, something like, 400, 600 women that have been sort of appointed within the ranks of government to management positions, which is positive, right? It's not, and he admitted it's not 30%. It's much slower. But I should also mention another civil society effort, the changing the male face of the parliament, which advocated for both larger numbers of women running for elections, and actually some of those parliamentarians who actually stood for elections were impacted by this civil society effort. We also had many women who ran for local councils and were elected. There's one village in Sistan, Balochistan, where it's only women in the city councils. So there are definitely women themselves are pushing, and they're using every single opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, some more questions. Did you have a question? Yes, here in the front. Wait for the microphone and give your name and ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I hope you're patient with me. My talk may be a little bit long.
I don't want a long comment, so do you have a brief comment and a question?
Yes.
Okay, brief comment.
Okay.
Thank you.
First, let me appreciate what you asked.
And introduce yourself.
Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Jcpoa. I'm an Iranian American. And I appreciate the question you asked Dokey, Fussy, about why we are concerned about human rights in Iran, but why we don't question, for example, Saudi Arabia and others, as well as thanking Suzanne for stating the issue of politicizing human rights. Mm-hmm. And my main question is, as we are talking about human rights in Iran and we are in the US, I guess maybe one major issue could be the issue of how destructive is the role of United States with respect to human rights in Iran. Speaking of what Hadi said about the role of US, for example, in 1953 when US helped the collapse of Mossadegh, which was the most popular government in the history of 100 years of Iran.
Sure.
And also, when we talk about human rights, we see now U.S. government is threatening judges of the international courts that if they discuss anything about the record of U.S., they are banned and so forth. And we see a senior
Okay, I think
U.S. official.
We get the drift of this. I think I made very clear in my opening remarks that the U.S. was in
Sorry, I was late.
The U.S. was in a somewhat uncomfortable position itself, not just these issues in regard to Iran, but the separation of families at our southern border and so on. So I think there's always you can always charge hypocrisy, you can always charge double standards, but it doesn't take away from the fact that this is an important issue in its own right that has to be considered.
If you let me say what the U.S. policies recently has been, it is in fact against the progress of human rights in Iran. Okay. That's my main point. Okay. That when we see these sanctions against the Rouhani government, it is giving hardliners the upper hand. And that helps the government to close to the openings which was already existed. And the hypocrisy of this issue of human rights, as she mentioned, politicizing this, that we see Trump is hand to hand with Saudians who have no parliament, no election, and no force. Okay. And then we see all the attack is against Iran, and you don't.
Yes, please, I'd like to give the panel a chance. No, we've been talking about it. So
I want to clarify that I don't want it to seem that, yes, there's hypocrisy on this end. There's also hypocrisy on the other end. Rouhani has not made human rights a priority, even a 5th or 10th priority, even a 20th priority. And as a human rights advocate, as a women's rights advocate, I'm extremely critical of that. I think it's problematic. Even his ministers or vice presidents who were supportive of human rights, he failed to support them. And it's a problem, yes, when the hardliners gain power, when there's a lot of tensions, we see everybody shifting to the right. We see Rouhani shifted to the right. I don't think the international situation had a lot to do with that. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of criticism to blame on the Iranian side as well. We expected, at a minimum, that they would allow civil society to they would facilitate that. They haven't done it. They failed to do it consistently. They failed to do it. And even when it's the hardliners abusing rights, Rouhani often fails to even speak up.
Yeah, no.
I don't want my comments to be misconstrued.
Yeah,
in that sense.
I think that, and I also said this in my opening remarks, that Iran should not improve its human rights record to please the United States. This is for Iran's
for civil
good.
Society.
It's for its own development, and to constantly blame others, even when the United States certainly, in my view, has not been very helpful and is hurtful with sanctions. Iran is complying with the nuclear deal the U.S. has violated, and so on. This is still not an excuse for what's going on in the country.
Can I respond to that?
No, I'm sorry. So, you can talk afterwards to our speakers if you like. Yeah.
I do not agree with the premise that because the United States and Iran had a difficult history, that particularly in 1953, that then precludes any kind of constructive engagement between the United States and Iran. I think that's incredibly destructive, and I don't think that helps anybody. I don't think it helps Iranians. I don't think it helps the United States. I don't think it helps our mutual interest in seeing a democratic Iran. I think the idea that the United States can't be constructive and can't be engaged on democracy and human rights issues because it doesn't have legitimacy is just false. And I think that it also condemns the Iranian people to living in a dictatorship, because without the United States, which is still the most powerful country in the world and the most committed to advancing democracy and human rights around the world, without the United States, you can't buoy global support. So I really do reject that. And I think that what we have to do is make the case to the United States government that it should make it more of a centerpiece, but in an authentic way, and in a way that's helpful. I'm not here to advocate for sanctions, but if there is going to be another difficult sanctions regime, let's give the Iranian people a chance. Let's get some democracy and human rights concessions from them. I mean, that's what I would say.
If it's possible, yeah. We'll go on to some other questions, yeah. All the way in the back, yeah.
Thank you. Azadeh Porzan from Islamic Republic Foundation. It was a very interesting panel. My question is more about as sort of an observer of what's happening in Iran sometimes, and also someone who's working on civil society, I feel very hopeful when I look at the sort of grassroots level, underground civil society work that's being done regardless of what's happening in the United States, in Iran, moderate hardliner government in power in both countries. But then I get really worried when I look at the sort of on a national level discourse of ordinary average internet users in the digital space, because I feel that it's becoming very polarizing to a point that, given that Iran is sort of maybe reaching a sort of an intersection of a potential crisis, are we as a nation ready in terms of our discourse on human rights and sort of a peaceful transition in any way? Are there any indications? I would love to hear the panelists' assessments.
That's a wonderful question. I mean, all of us who tweet on Iran are subjected sometimes to the most incredibly hideous criticism from people, and you kind of react to the criticism, makes you concerned and angry, and then you think, wait a minute, these are people who say they want a democracy in Iran, and they're threatening you, because you don't agree with them on every single point. How is this going to bring a democratic spirit to Iran, or is it just going to be 1979 all over again if these people succeed, and they'll just start butchering those that they disagree with, and claim they have a right to do it? How do you get out of the cycle of vengeance and factionalism that has also been part of Iranian history?
I think that's actually the most important challenge facing human rights advocate defenders, to prevent violence. We are approaching intersection of crisis, as you mentioned, Azadeh. And that violence can come on multiple fronts. First and foremost is increased violence by the state. More executions, more detentions, more torture, more repression, with real violence coupled into it, as we saw in 2009. Detainees in 2009 suffered unprecedented level of violence as detainees in order to take them off the streets. And the state has that potential, and that's my biggest concern right now, and the kind of advocacy I would promote in Human Rights Council and the broader international community. U.S. is not going to be the only player on the international stage, is to be prepared to push back against that violence. That's the first level of violence. The second level of violence that can happen is through some kind of, not quite civil war, but springing up of rebellious armed groups, especially in border regions, who are helped by Iran's adversaries in the region and outside, and we already know that is somewhat happening. But if they do become a major armed force, they could commit acts of violence, and in retaliation, the state would engage in more violence. We should be keeping our eyes very open. The third level of violence could be an just a complete military confrontation, not war, but the kind of violence we see in the region by state actors and non-state actors, raining missiles or chemical bombs or all kind of weapons that target civilians, don't discriminate. There is some slight chance of that happening down the road. That's the third level of violence I worry about. And then finally the fourth one, which actually been very heavy on my own conscience ever since I've been aware of these issues, which goes back to the Iranian Revolution, is that when you have crisis, when you have transition, when you have political power up in the air and different actors competing with it, how do you prevent violence becoming a tool of consolidation and the new political elite using it, just like in 1979 to 81? And I think that's the biggest cultural challenge we have. I know that this digital space to talk about, I don't know how much of it are people sitting outside Iran wishing for this violence to come about, so they have their chance to take revenge, and how much of it within Iran. I like to think the Iranian society, especially post-revolution born generation, is much more aware of the mistake of after revolution and will not support violence to this level as long as political leaders don't rise in exile who want to come out with knives and daggers to go after their opponents.
Yes, absolutely.
But that's going to be the biggest challenge. Even if we achieve regime not we, but whoever can bring about some kind of regime change, don't forget that at least 5 to 10% of the population, economically, politically, religiously, culturally, is very, and work-wise, is very tied to this regime or has worked for it. And you can't talk about purges and killings and revenge. So that is a challenge culturally we have to take up right now and educate the public in Iran about it.
I think that's a very big threat, but I think that also, sort of demonstrates how important it is that we have a more guided democratic transition, that we aim for a more guided democratic transition.
What do you mean by that?
A process.
A process, an internationally guided process, whereby over a series of years, it could take 10 years, but we pressure the Iranian government to hold free and fair elections, to release political prisoners, to open up civic space, to unblock the internet. I mean, these are clear things that we've asked for from other countries, and we've achieved at different sort of levels. And I think if we work globally, it's possible to do it. And I think it's really important to do it. The more vague we are, and I think this is what we suffer from, and this is why we're seeing this explosion of activity online that's very destructive, is the situation is vague. Yeah. The administration has said we stand with the Iranian people, we might want regime change, we don't, so it's very vague. And as it becomes vague, everybody comes out of okay, well, I'm going to be the next leader. I'm going to be the next leader. The MKO thinks they're going to be the leader. Reza Pahlavi thinks he's going to be the leader. Everyone's coming out and trying to figure out what do I need to do to destroy my opponents, instead of really looking at democratic reform. What are the steps that the Iranian government needs to take to reform? And I think that's the approach we need to be taking, not hinting at regime change so everybody can come and fight each other and destroy each other to finally become a leader.
I have an Iranian student in my class who who suffered under the regime and is very virulent about these issues. And he asked in a class that we had this week, why can't it be like South Africa? And we had a guest speaker, John Limbert, who I'm sure you all know, who said, well, where's the Nelson Mandela? And I was thinking about it later, and I realized, of course, the key thing with Nelson Mandela was not just the international support and respect that he had, but that he was nonviolent, and that he advocated, and he understood that their movement could only succeed if there was some sort of process of reconciliation with the people who had oppressed him and had oppressed the majority in that country. And I think that's what's missing. And maybe it will come at some point, but right now that's what's missing from the discourse of a lot of opponents of the regime, this sense that, we understand that we have to work with you, or this is just going to be a repeat of 79.
And this is an important point, because it appears there is a impoverishment of political leaders. It appears to feeling there's a vacuum. We only hear voices in exile. Mm-hmm. And the question is, we know any sustainable, meaningful change has to come from inside country, and is there political leadership inside the country? I mean, forget about, reformers and Mousavi Karoubi under house arrest and people within the regime who have agitated for change. But are there independent voices and political actors? That's really the million-dollar question. And I'm always told by people who lived in the country, who've interacted with that class, that yes, there are. They're not going to put their neck under the guillotine by coming out and speaking out just for 24 hours and be taken away and pay a heavy price for it. They want to substantially contribute when there is enough space, and that's where it goes back why it's so important what Dokey said. If we push for opening of at least freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and basic space that lets these people come out and not worry about being taken in and imprisoned or even executed, that is the first step toward filling that vacuum, to let those people inside the country come forward, put forward their ideas, and not have just these fringe voices outside.
And that goes back to my point that I made earlier about
Grassroots.
How the focus needs to change from the civil society in exile, or at least there needs to be some balance to civil society also inside of Iran. Actually, this issue of the polarization of the discourse on social media is very upsetting to me as well. And I think it's actually very intentional. The war is being fought out right now on social media, but it's not a free space. Iranians can't really participate on Twitter, right? It's filtered inside the country, and many people are not there. If you really want some sort of depth in your discussion, go to Telegram, for example, or Telegram a few months ago, where you have greater depth. But I think it's important. I am hopeful. I think this voice is very weak. It's suppressed by both sides, both by people, by security forces inside of Iran, and then also by regime changers. They don't want to hear anything that's nuanced. It has to be black and white. Either you're for the most extreme forces and elements inside the country, or you're for the most extreme forces and elements outside the country. But there's this whole range. They don't necessarily all agree with one another, and they may fall on one side or the other, but there is a nuanced perspective about the future of the country, and it's important that we hear what they have to say. And there is an emergence of this third discourse, which is extremely hopeful for me, and I'd like to see more people. And I think there are, people like Zia Nabavi, who spent 10 years in prison. Just read his tweets. They're
What is
so Zia Nabavi, and he writes in Farsi. People like Bahar Hedayat, who's not on social media but has a very similar perspective, who doesn't, who's very inclusive and acknowledges of the issues, or a range of issues. Somebody like Abdul Fattah Sultani, right? Who can really be a pillar of inclusion, in practice, somebody who exemplifies and acts out inclusion, understanding. From prison, he offered to be the lawyer for Ahmadinejad, as deputy, right? He said, I'm willing to do it. They're the ones who threw him in prison, right? And even after he came out of prison. So I do see this third discourse, these people who are emerging. But that polarization on social media, I think that's where the war is being worn out. And it ends up being the two extremes talking to each other and justifying their existence based on the existence of the other. And as civil society, I think it's the onus, and human rights advocates, the onus is upon us to sort of guide Iranian society not to only act out and react from a place of anger, right? But to calm that anger and help find solutions. I have problems with social media groups that sort of pit Iranians against one another, where we should be saying, no, we're here together, in it together, and we need to find solutions that are inclusive, and advocating that.
Yes, here in the front. Wait for the mic.
Hello, my question is
Can
to
you tell us
Susan.
your name?
I'm sorry, my name is Zainab. I study on human rights and also women's rights. And my question is to Susan. Since the revolution, as you said, there are many improvements on women's rights. I also believe that. But U.S. applied the economic ban, the sanction, it didn't work. And also the women protested the government, even they shaved their hair. And if there's no hair, so there's no need for hijab, they said, but it didn't work. And many other kinds of things that happen. I know there will be an improvement in maybe 50 years or 100 years later. We will not talk about this issue, but still there are really little improvements, and U.S. didn't want to, now they are not, the government, not the part of Human Rights Council. So there must be a way to improve these human rights in Iran, but I'm trying to find the strategy because the anger didn't work. So do you have any suggestions?
I think what Dokey had to say was fabulous. I mean, she laid out a whole series of proposals, but you have to be specific, you have to push them, you have to work internationally to get people behind these goals. So I think there are strategies that have worked, that have made a difference. There are also individual cases. I mean, maybe it won't work anymore. I remember there was a woman who was threatened with being stoned to death for adultery. And in the end, there was such an international outcry against this that it didn't happen. So if you focus, on a particular individual, a particular case, you can make a difference, I think.
We haven't had many legal gains, yes. Our legal gains have been minimal. There have been some, but they've been minimal. Now they're discussing the increase in the age of marriage to 15 and 16. They had proposed to have it 18. Right?
It was 9, right?
It was
After the
9.
revolution,
so,
it got raised to 13.
So there are
age.
more custody cases being given to women, custody of children being given. So the legal challenges are huge, and there's definitely not a political will to address the legal discriminations against women. But it doesn't mean that socially women haven't changed. And really, the last 5-6 years, I've been working in the region a lot. And culturally, I think Iran is very different. We have a very strict legal system that discriminates against women. That's justified on a very conservative interpretation of Sharia law. And even people within high-ranking government, conservatives, sort of, have also progressed, and they've changed. Raisi was talking about during the elections. He was talking about how his wife went to university, got her PhD, that she works.
This was the hard line,
they want to make women stay home, but their wives are working and they have PhDs. So the change has happened, and I credit this to the women's movement. But socially, women have gained a lot. So if I tell you that a lot of this probably doesn't happen, you're from Turkey. Yeah. Maybe in many parts of Turkey. Some parts of Turkey are very progressive, but women and men, when there's no legal solution, people find their own way, and women have been finding their own way, and that their own way is not always positive, but they still do. So one crisis in Iran is white marriage, this cohabitation. For the government, it's a crisis. That women and men are choosing to live together because marriage laws are not, undermine the equality of women, so women don't want to enter into marriage. It's hard for them to get divorced, but also the economic situation. It's not always a good thing, but people would never expect this from a country like Iran, that people are living together and their families actually know it. There's a problem with inheritance, so boys get twice as much as girls. So families are actually taking it upon themselves to leave a will. So where the law falls short, people are finding solutions. And I think compared to the region, socially, Iranian women have gained quite a bit, even though their legal discriminations are huge.
And I just want to add, just very quickly, without time to go into it, future of Iran, in my opinion, belongs to its women. The leaders who will be produced on all fronts. Already we see the most distinguished voices coming out of Iran on the international domestic space, not so much they can domestically shine, but internationally, if you look at most accomplished Iranians, many of them are women, and I think the future, once the space is available, even political leadership will be dominated by
Iranian
strong
women
women.
are amazing.
If you go to Iran, you will just see that within the fabric of the society. They are.
So the village councils, there's a village council in the most conservative province that's all women. So it's not, I think that's why I always talk about what women have achieved first, because I want to give that there's contradiction and there's...
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even just things like the hijab. When I started going to Iran 20-odd years ago, I had to be draped head to toe in dark, drab colors, big black scarf. And my last visit, admittedly, was 5 years ago. I wore normal clothes pretty much with a tiny little scarf on the back of my head. The women there barely wear hijab in many cases. They almost don't have to take it off because it's so minimal. And, this is corresponded to more music, more dancing, more openness in society in general, people living together and so on. So the culture has evolved enormously. The government still spouts the same old garbage, but the country has changed remarkably. Turkey has become more conservative. Iran has become less. Iran is not very religious. All of these things have happened because people don't like being told what to do, and if you try to force religion down their throats, they tend to rebel. Mm-hmm. And it's a fascinating country. I wish more people could get to go there. We're almost out of time. Let me take the last one last question from this gentleman right here.
My name is Andrew Fogel. I work for the Abdurrahman Borman Center, and I have a question specifically for Hadi. You mentioned the success of the drug reform late last year, piece of policy that's now moving in the implementation.
Relatives.
As people who work on the death penalty try to capitalize on the momentum of that reform, I'm wondering how you see a path forward now that we're confronted with these issues of Moharebe and Qisas and these pieces of the Islamic penal code that, unlike the drug issue, are not considered in this framework pieces of positive law amenable to change, but what divine mandates that the judiciary is very sensitive about. How do we engage that in this framework? Is there a way
talk a little bit about religious discrimination also more broadly, because you mentioned the Sufis, the dervishes, but it's Baha'is, it's Christians.
The numbers have dropped just for a year or two. We've got first of all, there are thousands of people still on the death row under the old law who are eligible for parole or reconsideration. We should make sure those people get due process and do not go to the gallows. I'm afraid this judiciary acts very politically, and whenever it needs to help the political system, it will push through a wave of executions of any kind. So we should keep our eye on those 5,000 to 7,000 people on the death row under the old law. And you're right, there are many other cases of application of death penalty which are much harder to push back because they claim they are intimately related to Sharia law that is not movable. But there have been arguments in Iran for decades by other clerics and theological people like Baghi, if you know him, has written extensively on qisas, which is basically law of retribution. You allow the family of a murdered person to decide if the alleged murderer should be executed or not, and that leads to a lot of injustices. Muharebe is extremely political.
Define that for
Muharebe is basically an act of enmity against God. It's just totally out of Inquisition type of thing that literally can let the judge very subjectively decide this person has acted against God. Technically, it's supposed to include raising arms or violence, but in many cases they ignored that precondition. But I think we need to again help the anti-death penalty campaigners in Iran, like Sotoudeh, like Mohammadi, who are in jail, to be out and pushing their campaigns forward so they can bring these voices within the religious community who are opposed to these applications. And it's not going to be easy.
Okay. We are out of time. What a great conversation. I have to say, I think it's the most nuanced conversation on this topic that I have heard. And I really want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank all of our panelists. It was just great. Thank you so much.